In the crisp mountain air, retired Force Recon Marine Michael Cooper was supposed to be enjoying a peaceful weekend, teaching his teenage son how to fish at Pine Ridge Campground. But when a rowdy group of outlaw bikers decided to terrorize the family campsite next door, they had no idea they were about to learn a hard lesson about judging a book by its cover, especially when that book was written by a decorated veteran with 15 years of special operations experience. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine needles and campfire smoke across Pine Ridge Campground on a cool Friday morning in September. Michael Cooper, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair and watchful gray eyes, methodically unpacked fishing gear from his weathered Ford F-150. At 6 feet 2 inches with the lean, muscular build of someone who never quite left their military discipline behind, Cooper moved with the fluid efficiency of a man accustomed to being aware of his surroundings. The faded USMC tattoo on his forearm caught the morning light as he reached for another box of gear. His 15-year-old son, Jason, sat on a nearby log, watching his father organize their weekend fishing expedition with the same precision he approached everything else. "Dad, you're setting up camp like we're still doing your survival training exercises," Jason teased. But there was admiration in his voice. It had been 3 years since Cooper had retired from the Marines after a distinguished career in Force Recon, and 5 months since his divorce was finalized. These father-son weekends had become precious time for them both. "Old habits die hard, buddy," Cooper replied with a slight smile, his eyes continuously scanning the tree line in a pattern developed over countless missions. He'd chosen this particular campsite for its elevated position and clear sight lines, another habit he'd never quite shaken. But today, those instincts were turned toward ensuring his son would have the perfect spot to learn fly fishing, not tracking hostile movements in foreign territories. Cooper paused his unpacking, watching Jason attempt to set up his new fishing rod. The sight brought back memories of his own father teaching him to fish on a similar mountain lake, years before he'd enlisted. It was one of the few peaceful memories that had helped him through 3 combat tours and countless special operations missions. Now, watching his son's determined expression, Cooper felt a familiar surge of protectiveness, the same feeling that had driven him to excel in Force Recon. "Hey, remember what I taught you about patience?" Cooper called out, walking over to help Jason with the rod. "Just like in martial arts class, rushing only makes things harder." The boy had been taking classes at Cooper's friend's dojo, another way they'd been bonding since the divorce. "You know, in the Marines, we spent more time preparing than actually doing. Same principle applies here." The morning sun filtered through the towering pines as other families began setting up their own camps nearby. A young couple with 2 small children had taken the site next to theirs, their kids excitedly exploring every pine cone and rock they could find. The father, struggling with a tent pole, gave Cooper a friendly wave, which he returned with a nod. Pine Ridge was one of the more popular campgrounds in the state park, known for its pristine lake and excellent fishing spots. Cooper had discovered it during his own recovery period, finding peace in the quiet waters and mountain views. "Hey, Mr. Cooper," called out Tom, the campground host, walking over with his clipboard. The older man's Vietnam veteran cap was worn with pride, and his careful gait spoke of old wounds earned in service. "Good to see you back again. Weather's perfect for fishing this weekend." Tom had taken a liking to Cooper during his previous visits, recognizing a fellow veteran in the way he carried himself. They'd shared coffee a few times, swapping stories about their service days. Tom in Vietnam, Cooper in Afghanistan and Iraq. "Thanks, Tom. Teaching Jason the basics of fly fishing this time?" Cooper responded, nodding toward his son who was now attempting to untangle his fishing line with teenage determination. "Figured it's time he learned something more challenging than dropping a line off the dock." "Good timing too," Tom added quietly, glancing around before continuing. "Had some trouble last weekend with rowdy types. Always feel better having someone with your background around." He tapped his own veteran's cap meaningfully before moving on to check on other campers. As the morning progressed, Cooper finished setting up their campsite with military precision. Everything had its place. Tent positioned for optimal awareness of surroundings, gear organized for easy access, and their food stored properly to avoid attracting wildlife. Some habits from his force recon days never left him, and he'd learned over the years that they served him well even in civilian life. The peaceful scene was exactly what Cooper had been looking for, a chance to reconnect with his son and maybe share some of the patience and focus that fishing had taught him during his own recovery from combat stress. Little did he know that this serene morning was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would require every bit of his training and self-control to handle what was coming up the mountain road, announced by the distant rumble of approaching motorcycles. 1. The first hint of disruption came with a low rumble echoing off the mountain slopes. Cooper's trained ear recognized the sound instantly. Multiple motorcycles, heavy cruisers approaching fast up the winding road to Pine Ridge. The noise grew steadily louder, shattering the morning tranquility and causing nearby campers to look up from their activities with concern. "Those guys are really gunning for it, aren't they?" Jason commented, still focused on organizing his tackle box. Cooper said nothing, but his posture shifted subtly, a change so slight only someone with similar training would notice. His eyes tracked to the campground entrance while his hands continued their work, muscle memory from years of maintaining situational awareness in hostile territories. The roar of engines crescendoed as 6 motorcycles burst into view, their riders ignoring the clearly posted 5 mph speed limit. They were riding formation, 2 by 2, in a way that made Cooper's jaw tighten, not casual weekend riders, but a gang with something to prove. Their black leather vests displayed patches identifying them as the Iron Wolves, a motorcycle club Cooper had heard Tom mention during previous visits, usually in the context of problems at other campgrounds. The lead rider, a massive man with a graying beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, raised his fist, signaling the others to stop. They pulled into the campground's central area, engines deliberately revving before cutting off. The sudden silence felt heavier than the noise had been. Cooper watched as nearby parents instinctively called their children closer, the young couple next door quickly retreating into their tent. "Looks like we got ourselves a prime spot, boys," the leader announced loudly, his voice carrying across the campground as he surveyed the area. His eyes settled on a vacant site near the lake, one reserved for another family, judging by the "reserved" tag still visible on the post. The other riders dismounted, their boots crunching on gravel as they began unloading cases of beer and camping gear that looked suspiciously unused. Tom appeared from his host cabin, clipboard in hand, walking with deliberate calm toward the group. "Afternoon, gentlemen, I'll need to see your reservation confirmation." His voice was steady, but Cooper recognized the tension in the older veteran's stance. The leader of the bikers turned slowly, looking down at Tom with obvious disdain. "Reservation? Yeah, we got one right here," he sneered, pulling out a wadded bill from his vest pocket and flicking it toward Tom's feet. His companions laughed, the sound harsh against the mountain quiet. "Consider our registration fee, old-timer." Tom's face reddened, but he held his ground, his Vietnam veteran's cap still sitting proud on his head. Cooper continued his preparations, movements unchanged, but his senses were now operating on high alert. He noted details with professional precision. 6 men, all carrying themselves with the cockiness of bullies used to intimidation. The leader and 2 others showed signs of prison time, distinctive tattoos and a certain institutional swagger. At least 3 had concealed weapons, judging by their movements and the way their vests hung. "Dad," Jason whispered, having finally picked up on the tension in the air. "Maybe we should go to a different spot to fish." "Not yet, buddy," Cooper replied quietly, maintaining his casual demeanor while positioning himself to keep both his son and the bikers in his field of vision. "Sometimes the best thing to do is stay right where you are and let things play out. Remember what I taught you about situational awareness?" The situation at the entrance was escalating. Tom stood his ground, explaining campground rules and regulations to increasingly hostile responses. Other campers were pulling their children inside, some already packing up to leave. The young couple next door was quietly loading their car, the father's hand shaking as he tried to break down their tent. 2 more motorcycles roared into the campground, their riders carrying additional cases of beer strapped to their bikes. One of them, A younger man with a fresh snake tattoo crawling up his neck caught Cooper's attention. The way he moved suggested military experience, dishonorable discharge, if Cooper had to guess, based on the chip-on-shoulder attitude and sloppy bearing. "Looks like we got ourselves a real family place here," the snake-tattooed biker called out, mockingly waving at a frightened family hurrying past. "Maybe we should join the morning sing-along, boys?" His companions roared with laughter, the sound echoing off the surrounding pines like a challenge to the peaceful morning. The relative calm was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. One of the bikers had knocked over a family's lantern, laughing as the parents scrambled to keep their children away from the shards. Another biker was already opening a beer, deliberately pouring some on the ground near a family's campsite. Cooper's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on the tent pole he was holding, but his face remained impassive. He knew from experience that what happened in the next few minutes would set the tone for the entire weekend. Cooper watched as Tom made one last attempt to maintain order, his Vietnam veteran pride keeping him steady despite being clearly outmatched. "This is a family campground, gentlemen. If you can't follow the rules, I'll have to ask you to leave and call the Rangers." The response was predictable: more laughter, more revving engines, and a clear message that the Iron Wolves weren't going anywhere. Cooper knew that park rangers were at least 30 minutes away, even if Tom had already called them. A lot could happen in 30 minutes, and judging by the escalating situation, something was bound to break soon. In his experience, bullies like this always pushed until someone pushed back. The situation deteriorated quickly over the next 15 minutes. The Iron Wolves had claimed 3 campsites near the lake, ignoring the reserved signs and spreading out their minimal gear. Empty beer cans already littered the ground as loud music blasted from a portable speaker, drowning out the natural sounds of the wilderness. The smell of marijuana drifted across the campground, causing parents to usher their children into RVs and tents. Cooper observed it all while showing Jason how to tie proper fishing knots, his movements deliberate and calm, but his trained eye caught every detail. The way the snake-tattooed biker kept pacing near the family campsites, how the leader positioned himself to intimidate anyone walking to the restrooms, the subtle hand signals between members that suggested prison yard communication. "Hey!" A sharp cry cut through the heavy metal music. The young father from the neighboring campsite was confronting one of the bikers. "That's our cooler you're taking!" His voice trembled, but he stood his ground, his wife watching nervously from their half-packed car with their children inside. The biker, a heavy-set man with brass knuckles hanging from his belt loop, turned slowly. "Prove it," he growled, cracking open a beer he'd pulled from the contested cooler. The father's face reddened, his fists clenching uselessly at his sides. Cooper set down his fishing line. "Stay here, Jason," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used giving orders in combat situations. "If anything happens, get in the truck and lock the doors." Jason nodded, understanding the seriousness in his father's voice. "That's enough." Tom's voice rang out as he approached again, this time holding his phone. "I've called the Rangers. They're on their way. You need to leave now." The old veteran's courage was admirable, but Cooper could see the situation balancing on a knife's edge. The leader of the Iron Wolves, who'd been watching the cooler confrontation with amusement, stalked over to Tom. "You called the cops on us, old man?" He towered over the camp host, tobacco-stained teeth bared in what might have been a smile. "Maybe you need a reminder of how things work out here in the real world away from your little rulebook." Cooper had already started moving, his stride purposeful but unhurried. Years of experience had taught him that looking like you're rushing into a situation often made it worse. He positioned himself casually near the confrontation, appearing to check the community bulletin board while staying within arm's reach of both Tom and the young father. "Looks like we got another Boy Scout," sneered the snake-tattooed biker, noticing Cooper's presence. "What's the matter, big guy? Looking for your merit badge in peacekeeping?" The leader turned his attention from Tom, sizing up Cooper with the practice eye of someone used to sizing up potential threats. "Mind your own business, friend. This is between us and the old-timer." Cooper kept his voice level, his stance relaxed but ready. "Actually, it's everyone's business now. You're ruining a lot of families' weekends." He gestured to the frightened children watching from car windows and RV doors. There's plenty of room up here for everyone if we all follow the basic rules. The heavy silence that followed was broken by the sound of splitting wood. One of the bikers had kicked over a family's camping table, sending their dinner preparations crashing to the ground. A child started crying somewhere, and Cooper noticed Jason watching intently from their campsite, his hand on the truck door handle just as instructed. Rules? The leader laughed, but there was no humor in it. Let me explain something to you since you're new here. We make the rules now. Anyone who doesn't like it can leave. Or, he cracked his knuckles meaningfully, they can try to do something about it. Two more bikers moved to flank their leader, creating a wall of leather and attitude. Cooper noticed how they positioned themselves, amateur intimidation tactics, but effective against civilians. Behind them, the snake-tattooed biker was now openly rummaging through another family's campsite, tossing items aside with deliberate disrespect. An elderly couple who had been quietly packing their car dropped a bag of supplies, spilling its contents. When they bent to pick it up, one of the bikers kicked their belongings further away, laughing as they scrambled to retrieve their possessions. Tom started forward to help them, but the leader blocked his path. Cooper had seen this moment hundreds of times before, in back alleys of foreign cities, in remote villages, in contested territories. The moment when bullies, drunk on their own power, made the mistake of pushing too far. He could already tell this wasn't going to end peacefully, but he had to try one last time for the sake of all the families watching. His mind flashed back to similar situations during his force recon days, hostiles terrorizing local villages, thinking their numbers and aggression made them untouchable. Those situations had taught him that sometimes the only language bullies understood was a demonstration of superior force. As he watched another family hurriedly packing their car, Cooper knew that the next few minutes would determine whether Pine Ridge Campground remained a family destination or became another territory claimed by intimidation and fear. Here's my counteroffer, Cooper spoke with the calm authority that had commanded elite units in combat zones. You boys pack up, head out, and we forget this happened. Tom here doesn't press charges for harassment and theft. His eyes met the leader's gaze steadily. Or we can do this the hard way, and you explain to the rangers why you've got concealed weapons in a state park. The leader's eyes narrowed at the mention of weapons. Several of his companions shifted uncomfortably, hands instinctively moving toward hidden firearms. Cooper noted each movement, cataloging threats just as he had done countless times in combat. You threatening us, tough guy? The snake-tattooed biker stepped forward, his prison yard swagger on full display. There's 8 of us and 1 of you. Maybe you need some help with that math. A crowd had gathered at a safe distance, phones recording the confrontation. The young father, whose cooler had been stolen, was still nearby, looking uncertain whether to stay or retreat. Tom stood his ground, his Vietnam veteran's pride evident in his rigid posture. Last warning, Cooper said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent campground. Leave now while you still can. Something in his tone, the absolute certainty, the complete lack of fear, made several of the bikers exchange glances. Cooper's mind automatically calculated angles and distances, just as he'd done countless times in combat situations. 8 targets, 3 armed, 2 with probable combat experience. The calculations came naturally, muscle memory from years of similar assessments. The leader, however, was too committed to back down. He stepped into Cooper's personal space, tobacco-stained breath hot with aggression. Or what, Boy Scout? You gonna show us some of those fancy camping skills? Dad! Jason's worried voice carried from their campsite. Cooper didn't turn, keeping his eyes locked on the threat in front of him, but he called back steadily, It's okay, son. Remember what I told you. His words carried the weight of someone who had handled far worse situations. Then everything happened at once. The leader, interpreting Cooper's attention to his son as distraction, threw a heavy punch aimed at Cooper's jaw. But Cooper wasn't there anymore. With the fluid efficiency of thousands of hours of combat training, he had already shifted, letting the punch sail past his ear. The leader's momentum carried him forward, directly into Cooper's precise strike to the solar plexus. As the big man doubled over, gasping, Cooper moved with practiced economy, disarming and neutralizing the snake-tattooed biker who had pulled a knife. The blade clattered to the ground as its owner followed, face first, into the dirt. Cooper's movements were a testament to years of specialized training. No wasted motion, no flashy displays, just ruthlessly efficient combat techniques honed in the world's most dangerous places. He flowed from one threat to the next like water, each action precise and purposeful. 2 more bikers rushed in, but Cooper's force recon training took over. The first biker's wild swing was deflected, his own momentum used to send him sprawling into his companion. The fourth attacker, the one with brass knuckles, managed to graze Cooper's shoulder before finding himself suddenly airborne, landing hard on an empty picnic table that collapsed under the impact. A fifth biker tried to circle behind, but Cooper had already anticipated the move. A quick sweep took the man's legs out from under him, followed by a controlled takedown that left him gasping in the dirt. The remaining bikers backed away, their earlier bravado evaporating as they watched their companions dispatched with professional precision. "Stay down," Cooper commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. "The Rangers will be here soon, and assaulting a federal officer is a serious charge." It was a bluff. He was retired, but delivered with such conviction that the bikers, still standing, froze in uncertainty. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Onlookers stood in stunned silence, phones still recording as Cooper maintained his ready stance, prepared for any further threats. Parents held their children close, watching with a mixture of fear and relief as the situation resolved itself. The leader, recovering his breath, looked up at Cooper with new understanding. The way the man moved, the precision of his strikes, the absolute control. This was no ordinary camper. "Who the hell are you?" he wheezed, clutching his midsection. "Just a dad trying to fish with his son," Cooper replied calmly, maintaining his ready stance. "But I spent 15 years in force recon dealing with people who thought intimidation made them powerful. Trust me, you don't want to continue this lesson." Several phones were still recording as the remaining bikers helped their fallen companions up. The leader, his previous bravado replaced with painful understanding, raised his hands in submission. "We're leaving," he announced, trying to salvage some dignity. "This ain't worth the hassle." Cooper watched as the Iron Wolves gathered their minimal gear, leaving behind the stolen cooler and other items they'd taken from campers. The sound of approaching sirens suggested the Rangers were finally near, but the situation was already diffused. Tom stepped forward to help return stolen items to their rightful owners, while other campers emerged from their retreats, relief evident on their faces. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, the leader paused, looking back at Cooper with a mix of respect and lingering resentment. "You should have said you were force recon." "You shouldn't have needed to know," Cooper replied evenly. "Being decent to others doesn't require knowing their background." He remained alert until the last motorcycle roared out of sight, his stance relaxing only when the sound had completely faded. As the last echoes of motorcycle engines faded into the distance, a different kind of tension filled Pine Ridge Campground, the electric atmosphere that follows narrowly averted disaster. Cooper remained alert, scanning the tree line out of habit, though his posture had relaxed slightly. Parents emerged from RVs and tents, children peeking out cautiously behind them. Jason approached his father, pride and concern mixing on his teenage face. "Dad, that was... I knew you were trained, but..." He struggled to find the right words. Cooper placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Remember what we talked about after your first martial arts class?" Cooper asked quietly. "About how real strength isn't about hurting people, but protecting them?" Jason nodded, watching as his father helped the elderly couple retrieve their scattered belongings. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones you try hardest to avoid." 2 ranger vehicles pulled into the campground, lights flashing. The lead ranger, a sharp-eyed woman named Rodriguez, took statements while her partner collected the abandoned knife and brass knuckles as evidence. Tom provided the phone footage from multiple campers, clear documentation of both the bikers' harassment and Cooper's measured response. "Quite a morning," Ranger Rodriguez commented, reviewing the videos. Her experienced gaze caught every detail of Cooper's efficient movements. Most civilians would have either run or escalated immediately. You maintained control of the situation perfectly. She paused the video. Force recon? Former, Cooper replied simply, filling out his statement form. Just trying to enjoy some fishing with my son. He gestured toward Jason, who was helping the young family reorganize their campsite, returning items the bikers had scattered. The ranger nodded knowingly. 15 years of service shows. That takedown was textbook perfect. We've had trouble with the Iron Wolves before, but never had anyone handle them so professionally. She made some final notes in her report. They won't be welcome in any state park after this. We'll make sure of that. The campground community transformed in the hour that followed. What had been a loose collection of separate families became something more cohesive. The elderly couple whose belongings had been scattered invited nearby children to share their fresh-baked cookies. The young father, whose cooler had been stolen, now helped another family repair their damaged picnic table. A group of campers had organized an impromptu community dinner, sharing their supplies to replace the food that had been destroyed or stolen. The atmosphere had shifted from fear to celebration, the shared experience creating bonds between strangers. Children played together while parents swapped camping stories, the morning's tension replaced by a sense of community. "You know," Tom said, bringing Cooper and Jason each a hot coffee from his cabin. "In all my years running this campground, I've never seen someone handle a situation like that." The old veteran's eyes held understanding. No shots fired. No one seriously hurt. Just clean, professional peacekeeping. Reminds me of the best officers I served under in Nam. "I'm no hero," Cooper corrected gently, showing Jason how to repair the broken tent pole of a neighboring campsite. Just someone who couldn't stand by and watch good people being harassed. Sometimes standing up is the only choice we have. As the afternoon sun filtered through the pines, the campground settled back into its natural rhythm. Children returned to playing, though now they included Jason in their games, asking excited questions about his dad. Cooper noticed how his son stood a little taller, understanding now what his father had always tried to teach him about responsibility and courage. Several campers had gathered by the lake, sharing stories and setting up fishing spots. The young father, whose cooler had been stolen, approached Cooper. "I was scared to stand up to them," he admitted. "Been thinking about what I should have done differently." "You did stand up," Cooper replied, testing his fishing line. "That takes courage, especially when you're protecting your family. The trick is knowing how to stand up effectively." He demonstrated a proper knot for the man's son, who watched with rapt attention. "Think they'll come back?" Jason asked as they finally returned to setting up their fishing gear. Cooper shook his head, checking his tackle box. "Bullies rarely return to places where they've lost face," he explained. "Besides, the Rangers have their descriptions and license plates now. This campground is probably off their list for good." A family walking past to the lake waved warmly, their young daughter proudly wearing a junior ranger badge. The father nodded respectfully to Cooper, a silent acknowledgement between men who understood the importance of standing up for others. "You know what's funny, Dad," Jason said, successfully tying his first proper fishing knot. "This morning you said we'd learn about patience and focus from fishing. I think we learned those lessons before we even got to cast a line." Cooper smiled, watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold. The campground host was making his evening rounds, stopping to chat with families who had decided to stay despite the morning's excitement. Children's laughter echoed across the water, mixing with the songs of evening birds. The scene was peaceful again, but somehow different, stronger, more united. "Sometimes the best lessons find us when we least expect them," Cooper replied, helping Jason bait his hook. "Now, about that fishing lesson." The last rays of sunlight painted Pine Ridge Lake in brilliant oranges and purples as Cooper and Jason settled into their fishing spots. The evening air had grown cooler, carrying the mingled scents of pine needles and campfire smoke. Other families had also gravitated toward the water, creating a peaceful scene far removed from the morning's tension. "Remember, it's all in the wrist," Cooper demonstrated, showing Jason how to cast his line. "Just like I showed you, smooth and steady." He watched with pride as his son's cast flew true, the lure landing with a gentle plop in the golden water. "Perfect. You're a natural." Nearby, the young family whose cooler had been stolen was roasting marshmallows. Their children's laughter carried across the water, a sound that made Cooper smile. The father caught his eye and raised his coffee mug in a grateful salute. "Dad," Jason said quietly, reeling in slowly as instructed. "How did you know? I mean, this morning, with those guys. How did you know exactly what to do?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You weren't even scared." Cooper adjusted his line thoughtfully. "That's not true. I was scared." He let that sink in for a moment. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do what's right despite being afraid. In Force Recon, we learned that fear is just information. It tells you to be alert, to be ready. A fish jumped nearby, creating ripples that caught the fading light. Tom walked past on his evening rounds, checking on the campers with a new spring in his step. The old veteran had organized an impromptu campfire storytelling session for later, his way of bringing the community closer after the day's events. "The thing about bullies," Cooper continued, helping Jason adjust his grip, "is they expect everyone to be afraid. They count on it. But when someone stands up to them with confidence and control, they usually don't know how to handle it. Like when you told them you knew about their weapons." Jason nodded, understanding. "You weren't just guessing, were you?" "Years of training teach you to notice details," Cooper explained. "The way they moved, how their vests hung. Certain things become obvious when you know what to look for. But the important thing wasn't the fighting. It was trying to resolve things peacefully first." The sound of an acoustic guitar drifted across the water. Someone had started playing at the community campfire, and voices joined in singing. The campground had transformed from a collection of separate sites into something more communal, bound together by shared experience. "Mr. Cooper?" A small voice interrupted their conversation. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, stood nearby, clutching a paper plate. "Mom made extra s'mores. She said to bring you and Jason some." Behind her, her mother watched with a warm smile. "Thank you, that's very kind." Cooper accepted the plate, sharing the treats with his son. The simple gesture of gratitude spoke volumes about how the community had come together. As darkness settled over the lake, more families gathered around various campfires. Stories were shared, connections made, and the earlier fear was replaced by a sense of security and fellowship. Cooper noticed how other parents were more relaxed now, letting their children play freely in the growing dusk. "You know what, Dad?" Jason said, reeling in his line for another cast. "I think I understand now why you always say strength isn't just about being tough. It's about protecting people who need help." Cooper watched his son's profile in the fading light, seeing not just a boy but a young man beginning to understand important truths about the world. That's right. And sometimes strength is about showing mercy, even to people who might not deserve it. From their vantage point by the lake, they could see the entire campground. Tents glowed like paper lanterns. Voices and laughter mixed with the crackling of fires, and the stars began appearing overhead. It was the kind of peaceful scene Cooper had fought to protect during his years of service. "Got something," Jason suddenly exclaimed, his rod bending. Cooper guided him through the motions, letting him handle the catch himself. After a brief but exciting struggle, Jason pulled in a decent-sized trout, his first catch ever. "Way to go, son." Cooper helped him unhook the fish. Nearby campers applauded, and Jason beamed with pride. "See? Patience and focus pay off." As they prepared to release the fish back into the lake, Jason paused. "Hey, Dad. I'm really glad we came camping. Not because of what happened with those guys, but because, well, I think I understand you better now. Cooper watched the trout swim away into the darkening water. The evening had settled into a perfect calm, with crickets providing nature's symphony and the moon rising over the mountains. Tomorrow would be a new day, but the lessons of this one would stay with both father and son for years to come. "What do you say we head over to the campfire?" Cooper suggested, gathering their gear. "I think Tom's about to start his Vietnam stories. Those are always worth hearing." The community campfire cast dancing shadows across the gathered faces as Tom stood to address the growing circle of families. Over 30 campers had assembled, drawn by the warmth of both the fire and the company. Folding chairs and blankets formed a rough semicircle, with children sitting cross-legged on logs near the front, marshmallow sticks at the ready. Cooper and Jason found a spot near Tom, who gave them a knowing nod as they settled in. The old veteran cleared his throat, his Vietnam service cap catching the firelight. "You know, watching what happened today reminded me of something from my tour in '68, he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "We had this lieutenant," Tom continued, stoking the fire. "Young guy, fresh out of officer training. But he had this way about him. Couldn't be rattled, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Reminded me a lot of how you handled things today, Cooper." Several heads nodded in agreement, as Tom shared his story of how that lieutenant had diffused a tense situation in a Vietnamese village using patience and understanding rather than force. Cooper noticed Jason listening intently. The boy had never shown much interest in military stories before, but today's events had given them new meaning. "Anyone else have a service story they'd like to share?" Tom asked, settling back into his chair. There was a moment of quiet, broken only by the crackling fire and distant cricket songs. An older woman in a faded Ranger sweatshirt spoke up. "My husband was Army Rangers," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He always said the strongest warriors were the ones who knew when not to fight." She looked at Cooper. Today proved him right. The conversation flowed naturally, other campers sharing stories of family members who had served. The young father whose cooler had been stolen mentioned his grandfather at Normandy. A teenage girl talked about her sister currently serving in Afghanistan. Each story added another thread to the fabric of understanding that had wrapped around the campground community. Suddenly, a distant rumble of motorcycles cut through the night air. The effect was immediate. Children scooted closer to their parents. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Cooper remained relaxed, having already recognized the distinct sound of street-legal Harleys on the main highway, too far to be a concern. "Just tourists heading to the resort up the mountain," he said, calmly, his confidence spreading through the group. The tension dissolved as quickly as it had formed, replaced by a few nervous laughs. "Speaking of motorcycles," Tom grinned, breaking the moment, "let me tell you about the time we had to outrun Charlie on stolen scooters." The laughter that followed was genuine, the earlier anxiety forgotten. As the evening progressed, Cooper found himself sharing a few carefully chosen stories from his own service, nothing classified or too intense, but enough to give Jason glimpses of the world that had shaped his father. He talked about training missions in the mountains, about building schools in remote villages, about the importance of teamwork and trust. "Dad, you never told me about helping build that medical clinic in Afghanistan," Jason said during a break between stories, his voice filled with curiosity rather than accusation. "Some memories take time to share," Cooper replied, watching the flames dance, "and sometimes you need the right moment to understand them." He noticed other parents nodding in agreement, perhaps thinking of their own difficult conversations with their children. The fire had burned lower when Tom started another story, this one about a USO show that had gone hilariously wrong. Children who had been fighting sleep finally surrendered, curling up in their parents' laps or leaning against each other on the logs. The night air had grown cooler, but the circle around the fire remained warm and close. "You know what the real victory was today?" Tom said quietly to Cooper as his story wound down. "Not running those thugs off, though that was impressive enough. It's this right here." He gestured to the gathered families, the shared laughter, the sense of safety and community. You gave these people something better than protection. You gave them back their peace of mind. Ranger Rodriguez stopped by briefly to update the group. Patrols had been increased in the area, and there was no sign of the iron wolves anywhere in the park. Her news was met with appreciative nods, but Cooper noticed that the information, while welcome, wasn't as crucial to the campers' sense of security as it might have been earlier in the day. A young boy fighting sleep but determined to stay awake asked Cooper if he had ever been scared during his service. The question brought thoughtful silence to the circle. Cooper considered his answer carefully, aware of all the young ears listening. Being brave isn't about not feeling fear, he explained, his voice carrying easily across the quiet gathering. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. Every person here who stood their ground today, who helped their neighbors, who chose to stay and be part of this community, they all showed real courage. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and clear in the mountain sky, as more stories were shared and connections deepened. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, but this night belonged to the simple power of people coming together, finding strength in each other's experiences and courage in each other's presence. After the campfire gathering had wound down and families had drifted back to their sites, Cooper and Jason sat outside their tent, enjoying the peaceful mountain night. The lake reflected the nearly full moon, its surface occasionally broken by jumping fish. The sweet scent of pine mixed with the lingering smoke from dying campfires, creating that distinct mountain air that can only be found in places far from civilization. "You were really something today, Dad," Jason said, wrapping himself in a blanket against the cooling night air. "At first, when those guys showed up, I thought we'd have to leave like everyone else wanted to. But you stayed so calm, like it was just another day at the office or something." Cooper leaned back in his camp chair, studying the star-filled sky. The constellations seemed brighter here, away from city lights, reminding him of nights in Afghanistan. "You know, in Force Recon, we had a saying, the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. It wasn't about being tough. It was about being prepared, controlled. The loudest ones usually aren't the ones you need to worry about." A pair of rangers made their evening patrol rounds, flashlight beams sweeping methodically through the campground. They paused briefly at Cooper's site, offering a respectful nod before moving on. Their presence was more routine than necessary now, but it added to the campers' sense of security. "Tom told me something interesting while you were getting more firewood," Cooper said, pouring hot chocolate from a thermos for them both. "Apparently those bikers had done this before at other campgrounds. Always picked family places, always relied on intimidation. No one ever stood up to them." Jason wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "Because people were scared?" "Because people felt alone," Cooper corrected gently. "That's how bullies work. They make each person feel isolated, helpless. But look what happened when people came together today. Look how strong this community became. Every person who stayed, who helped clean up, who shared their food, they all fought back in their own way." From nearby campsites came the soft murmur of conversations, occasional laughter, the distinct sounds of families settling in for the night. The atmosphere was completely transformed from the tense silence of that morning. Children's voices carried clearly across the quiet campground as they begged for one more story before bed. "Did you learn all this in the Marines?" Jason asked, genuinely curious. How to handle people like that? Cooper considered the question. "The Marines taught me the techniques, sure, but the most important lessons came from understanding people. Fear, courage, community. These things are universal. Whether you're in a combat zone or a campground, people need to know they're not alone." A shooting star streaked across the sky, prompting a quiet wow from Jason. The moment reminded Cooper of nights in Afghanistan, looking up at these same stars while on watch, thinking about his son back home. Now here they were, sharing this moment together. "Your mother called while you were fishing earlier," Cooper mentioned. "I told her about what happened. She was worried at first, but when I explained how you handled yourself, staying calm, helping others afterward, she was really proud. We both are. Jason sat up straighter, surprised. Really? Even though there was trouble? Especially because there was trouble, Cooper explained. Life isn't about avoiding difficult situations. It's about how we handle them when they come. You showed real maturity today, son. Sometimes the hardest part isn't facing the danger. It's keeping your head afterward. Their conversation was interrupted by Tom approaching with a pot of coffee. Thought you boys might like a refill, he said, topping off their mugs. Beautiful night for stargazing. The old veteran settled into a spare chair, his Vietnam cap now tucked in his pocket. The three sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the mountain. A great horned owl called from somewhere across the lake, its haunting voice echoing off the water. The peace of the moment stood in stark contrast to the morning's chaos. You know, Tom said finally, days like today remind me why I keep running this place. It's not just about maintaining a campground. It's about protecting these moments, these chances for families to connect, for communities to form, for memories to be made. What happened today, Cooper? You didn't just stop some troublemakers. You helped preserve what makes this place special. Cooper nodded, understanding completely. It was the same reason he'd served, not for glory or excitement, but to protect these simple, precious moments of peace and connection. As the night grew deeper and Tom bid them good night, Cooper noticed Jason fighting to keep his eyes open. Time for bed, son. Tomorrow's going to be a full day. Yeah, Jason yawned, standing up. Hey, Dad. Thanks for not letting those guys ruin our trip. And thanks for, showing me what it means to be strong the right way. Cooper watched his son disappear into the tent, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Sometimes the best lessons came from the most unexpected situations. As he did one final check of their campsite, his military habits serving a gentler purpose now, he reflected on how this trip had already given them both more than he'd expected. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over Pine Ridge Campground. Cooper was already awake, a habit from his military days, sitting by the rekindled fire with a steaming cup of coffee. The lake's surface was like glass, disturbed only by occasional fish breaks. Early morning mist clung to the water, creating an almost mystical scene as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce through the pine trees. A few other early risers nodded to him as they passed, heading to the communal bathrooms or starting their morning routines. There was a different feeling in these greetings now, a sense of shared experience, of community forged through adversity. The events of yesterday had transformed strangers into neighbors. Ranger Rodriguez appeared out of the morning mist, making her early rounds. Thought you'd be up, she said, accepting Cooper's offer of coffee. Got some news you might be interested in? State police picked up our friends from yesterday at a gas station about 50 miles south. Apparently, they were carrying more than just those weapons we saw. Cooper nodded, unsurprised. His assessment of the bikers had suggested they were involved in more serious activities. Good to hear. The families here will rest easier knowing that. Cooper chuckled, but his response was interrupted by Tom approaching with his morning clipboard and a knowing smile. Beautiful morning, isn't it? You two up for some fishing lessons later? I know a spot where the rainbow trout are practically begging to be caught. Been saving it for someone who'd appreciate it properly. The morning continued to unfold, peaceful and bright, as if yesterday's events had happened in another world. Yet Cooper could see the lasting effects in small ways, how the campers looked out for each other, the strengthened sense of community, the way people carried themselves with more confidence. Even the children seemed to play with a new sense of security, their parents watching more relaxedly from camp chairs. Jason, setting out their fishing gear, paused thoughtfully. Hey, Dad. You think we could make this a regular thing? Coming up here, I mean. Not the fighting part, he added quickly with a grin. But just this. Being out here, together. Cooper looked at his son, seeing not just the boy he'd been, but the man he was becoming. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Very much." Around them, Pine Ridge Campground was fully awakening to a new day. Children played between the sites, parents prepared for hiking or fishing, and the morning sun warmed away the last of the mist from the lake. Yesterday's events, while not forgotten, had transformed into something positive, a reminder of the strength found in community and the importance of standing up for what's right. The morning peace shattered with the roar of approaching motorcycles, not the distant sound of highway traffic this time, but the deliberate thunder of machines coming up the campground road. Cooper recognized the difference instantly, his body tensing before his mind consciously processed the threat. "Everyone inside!" Tom's voice carried across the campground, the old veteran already moving to warn the families nearest the entrance. Parents quickly gathered their children, but there was none of yesterday's panic. Instead, Cooper noticed people moving with purpose, older kids helping younger ones, adults positioning themselves protectively. "Jason," Cooper said calmly, "remember where I told you to wait if trouble came?" His son nodded, already moving toward their truck, but instead of getting in, Jason paused. "Dad, look." He pointed toward the young family next door struggling to gather their small children. "They need help." Cooper felt a surge of pride even as he assessed the approaching threat. "Go help them," he said, "then get somewhere safe." His son moved without hesitation, helping the mother gather her kids while the father collected their valuables. Ranger Rodriguez's patrol vehicle appeared at the camp entrance, lights flashing. Through the trees, Cooper counted at least 12 motorcycles approaching, more than yesterday, and the sound of their engines suggested heavier machines. These weren't weekend warriors. The synchronized rumble spoke of experienced riders. "Iron Wolves?" Tom asked, appearing at Cooper's shoulder. The old veteran held his walking stick like a weapon, and Cooper noticed several other men emerging from their campsites, armed with baseball bats and camping tools. "No," Cooper replied, recognizing the different engine sounds. "Different group. Probably friends of theirs." He moved toward the entrance, his stride purposeful. "Tom, get everyone back. If these guys are who I think they are, they're more dangerous than yesterday's bunch." The motorcycles rounded the final bend, massive machines painted matte black, their riders wearing matching leather cuts with a different insignia. A blood-red skull with crossed chains. The lead rider, a massive man with a graying beard and multiple face scars, cut his engine. The sudden silence felt like the calm before a storm. "We're looking for the guy who messed with our brothers yesterday," the leader announced, his voice carrying across the now empty campground center. "Got some business to settle." Cooper stepped forward, positioning himself between the bikers and the campsites. He noticed Ranger Rodriguez quietly speaking into her radio. Reinforcements would be at least 20 minutes away. A lot could happen in 20 minutes. "Your brothers were breaking the law," Cooper replied evenly. "They chose to leave. Suggest you do the same." A harsh laugh rippled through the biker group. "Ex-military, right? Just like they said. Well, we got some veterans too." He gestured to several riders who carried themselves with familiar military bearing. "Difference is we learned not to fight other people's battles." "Protecting innocent people isn't other people's battles," Cooper responded, his voice carrying clearly. "It's what we swore to do." The leader dismounted, his boots crunching on gravel. 4 others followed, spreading out in a practiced formation that confirmed Cooper's suspicion. These weren't just bikers, they were trained fighters. He noticed their subtle hand signals, the way they established overlapping fields of view. These men had seen combat. "Last chance to walk away, Marine," the leader called out, though his hands were already curling into fists. "No need for this to get messy." Cooper's response was interrupted by movement behind him. Tom had returned, and he wasn't alone. At least 10 other men from the campground had formed a line, including several veterans Cooper had met at last night's fire. They carried themselves with quiet determination. "He's not alone," Tom announced, his Vietnam veteran's cap set firmly on his head. "And this isn't just his fight anymore." Ranger Rodriguez stepped up as well, her hand on her holster. This is a state park, gentlemen. Whatever grievance you have stops at our gate. The leader assessed the situation, his experienced eyes taking in the growing number of determined faces. Behind them, other campers had formed a second line of defense, armed with anything they could find. Even the teenagers, Jason among them, stood ready to protect the younger children. "Walk away," Cooper suggested quietly. "You trained like we did. You know how this ends, either with you leaving on your own or in cuffs when the state police arrive. And they are coming." Something shifted in the leader's stance, the subtle change of a warrior recognizing an untenable position. His men sensed it too, their aggressive postures easing slightly. "Your brothers made a mistake yesterday," Cooper continued. "Don't compound it today. Whatever they're paying you, it's not worth destroying everything the uniform stood for." The leader's scarred face tightened, but Cooper saw the conflict in his eyes. Finally, he spat on the ground. "Mount up," he barked to his men. "This camp ain't worth the trouble." As the bikers roared away, the campers maintained their positions until the last engine faded. Then, as if on cue, the tension broke. People laughed, hugged, and celebrated not just their safety, but their unity. Jason approached his father, standing taller than he had yesterday. "We did it, Dad. All of us. Together." Cooper smiled, watching the community celebrate around them. "That's right, son. That's how battles should be won. Not with fists, but with people standing together for what's right." 1 month later, the Coopers' Ford F-150 once again climbed the winding road to Pine Ridge Campground. The late summer sun painted the mountains in rich golds and deep greens, and the familiar scent of pine needles welcomed them back. "Look, Dad," Jason pointed to a new sign at the entrance. "Pine Ridge Campground, where community matters." Below it hung a smaller placard, "Protected by veteran park rangers and active community watch." Tom was waiting at the check-in cabin, his Vietnam veteran's cap now accompanied by a shiny Head of Community Security badge. The events of that weekend had sparked changes throughout the state park system. Pine Ridge had become a model for other campgrounds, implementing community-based security programs that brought campers together. "The Cooper boys," Tom called out warmly. "Perfect timing. We've got your usual spot ready." He handed them an updated campground map showing new features like emergency call boxes and designated community gathering areas. "Things have changed a bit since your last visit." As they drove to their campsite, Cooper noticed those changes everywhere. Families still enjoyed the peaceful setting, but there was a new awareness, a sense of shared responsibility. Children played freely while parents kept casual but alert eyes on their surroundings. Several sites displayed veteran service flags, a subtle signal of protectors in their midst. "Remember this spot?" Jason asked as they passed the central fire pit. "Where you stood that morning?" Cooper nodded, but noticed his son wasn't dwelling on the confrontation. Instead, Jason waved to a group of kids he'd befriended during their last visit. The young family they'd helped that day was back too, their children running over to greet Jason like an old friend. "Your boy's quite popular," said a familiar voice. Ranger Rodriguez approached, now wearing a senior ranger badge. "That incident sparked something special here. We've had 3 other campgrounds adopt our new community program. Even had some motorcycle clubs, the law-abiding ones, volunteer to help patrol the park roads." Setting up their camp, Cooper watched Jason confidently help a new family struggling with their tent. His son moved with a new assurance, not from learning about confrontation, but from understanding the importance of community and standing up for others. "You know what's really changed, Dad?" Jason said later as they prepared their fishing gear. "Everyone here looks out for each other now. It's like you said, strength isn't just about one person being tough, it's about people coming together." The evening brought another community campfire, now a regular tradition at Pine Ridge. Tom shared his Vietnam stories, but they weren't just tales of conflict anymore. They were lessons about unity, about standing together, about finding strength in community. Cooper noticed how the other campers listened to Jason too, as his son shared his perspective on what had happened that day. The story had grown beyond just a confrontation with troublemakers. It had become a testament to what people could achieve together. "We got another letter from that family," Jason mentioned as they cast their lines into the sunset-painted lake. "The ones we helped that day? Their daughter's school invited you to speak about community service and standing up to bullying." Cooper smiled. The ripples from that weekend had spread far beyond Pine Ridge. Other parks had reported fewer incidents of harassment, not because of increased security, but because communities had learned to stand together. "You know what makes me proudest, son?" Cooper asked, watching Jason skillfully land a trout. "Not what I did that day, but what you did. You showed real courage, not the fighting kind, but the kind that brings people together." As darkness settled over the campground, the sound of laughter and conversation drifted across the lake. Families gathered in small groups, sharing meals and stories. Children played spotlight tag between the campsites while parents watched from lawn chairs, comfortable in their shared vigilance. "Think they'll ever come back?" Jason asked quietly, not needing to specify who they were. "No," Cooper replied confidently. "But if trouble ever does return, it won't find a scattered group of afraid individuals. It'll find a community that stands together." They walked back to their campsite under a sky full of stars, passing families who nodded in recognition. The legend of what happened that summer day had grown, but the real story wasn't about one former Marine standing up to troublemakers. It was about a community discovering its own strength. "Next weekend's the big inter-campground picnic," Jason reminded his father. "Tom says nearly every park in the state is sending people to learn about the community program." Cooper looked at his son, seeing not just the boy he'd been that first weekend, but the young man he was becoming. The kind of person who understood that true strength wasn't found in fists or force, but in the bonds between people who chose to stand together. As they reached their tent, the peace of Pine Ridge settled around them like a comfortable blanket. The campground had changed, but its heart remained the same, a place where families could find not just recreation, but community, strength, and the kind of memories that lasted a lifetime. "Hey, Dad," Jason said as they prepared for bed. "Thanks for teaching me what real strength looks like." Cooper smiled in the darkness. Sometimes the best lessons came in unexpected ways, and some victories created changes that lasted long after the moment of conflict had passed.